It's no use. They've taken over the control tower. At this rate, they'll hack into the Alchemical Intelligence Core and trigger a catastrophic meltdown that would make Yellowstone look like a middle school baking soda volcano.
There must be something we can do.
I know, there's one thing we can do. We can move to the other side of the room.
Cut.
Well, what's the problem, bud?
You can go to the other side of the room? This is like the most intense point of the movie. Kaputko Pictures' greatest and most expensive film to date. Surely you can think of something cooler than that.
Hey, I'm just working with the script they gave me. What am I supposed to do? What's my motivation?
What's your motivation? Listen here, bud. Do you ever want to work in this town again? How's that for motivation? Now let's do it again. Lights, camera, action.
Everyone's a critic. But it's important that directors, even underqualified corporation-mandated ones, say lights, camera, action, because that's what every story, or really any kind of writing needs. Good, old-fashioned action. But don't misunderstand, I'm not saying that every story needs to be an action story. That's a whole different thing. What I am talking about is that unfortunately all too common thing that happens when you finish reading a story or poem or essay and feel like nothing happened, or maybe more accurately, that nothing mattered. It happens all the time that I'll read a story by a new writer that has some interesting ideas. The main character is suddenly and mysteriously transported to an alternate dimension full of strange and mysterious creatures. Then they follow a curious stranger down a path where they encounter some mischievous monsters who steal their hat. Then they wander into a magical forest where all the trees look like neon lights. Then they trip on a root and tumble down a hill and land in a toxic swamp, but they happen to find a rope that they grab onto and it pulls them up a sharp cliff right beside the portal that will take them back home, and a stiff breeze knocks them in. On the surface, there sort of appears to be a plot here. Something unexpected and unusual happens that gets the story going, the protagonist ends up in increasingly perilous situations, and they eventually find a resolution and a restoration of the initial stability. But here's the problem. The hero of our story doesn't actually matter. They were the narrative equivalent of an amusement park guest sitting in a little car on rails that drives them through a series of interesting vignettes while cheery music plays in the background. Things happened, and you could even call them interesting things, but ultimately there was no action. Nothing really mattered, and it's really hard to care about. Okay, cool. Interchangeable protagonist number 478 sat on a conveyor belt in Imaginary World 2248 and stayed for the whole ride. Who cares? We've got lights, a camera, but no action. But what do you mean? Plenty of things happened. There were lots of good action verbs too. I made sure of it. Yeah, but when I say your writing needs action, I mean something more technical than just things happening. I mean what friend of the show Kenneth Burke meant when he wrote, dramatistically, the basic unit of action would be defined as the human body in conscious or purposive motion. This kind of action is something that Burke differentiates from motion, and it makes all the difference whether you're writing fiction or even poetry. So let's make sure that we understand the difference. For Burke, motion is what happens essentially when the laws of physics influence an object. Set a ball at the top of a hill and it will roll down thanks to gravity. That's motion. Get a planet, give it an atmosphere, spin it around in the vicinity of a star, and you'll probably get thunderstorms and hurricanes. More motion. Stay out in a hurricane and your hair will get messed up. Again, motion. The key is that when motion occurs, we refer to it as something that just happens. Nobody did the ball rolling down the hill or did the hurricane. Those things happened spontaneously and independently because of the natural order of things. And because motion just happens, it doesn't mean very much to most people. Oh wow, you're telling me that a balloon full of helium went up? Groundbreaking stuff. Oh, that block of iron sank to the bottom of the lake? Someone call the news. But action, as Burke says, is the product of the human body in conscious or purposive motion. In other words, action doesn't just happen because that's how physics works. Action happens because someone decides to do something and then does it. So a block of iron sinking is just motion. But someone tossing the iron statuette their former lover gave them into the lake in order to free themselves from the past, that's action. A hurricane is motion, but a supervillain designing a machine that can create hurricanes, that's action. And a character tripping over a root and falling down a hill is in motion, but a character who trips on a root and then fires their grappling hook to get up into the branches and hide from a monster is taking action. Action is what happens because someone deliberately did something. And action is, consequently, what makes stories interesting and meaningful. But that's not true. I love reading stories where nothing really happens. It's like this guy has never even heard of slice of life before. Or it's like this guy has heard of that and wants to point out that it's a niche genre, not the norm. The existence of stories that run low on action does not disprove the point that most readers of most things expect action and derive meaning from it. When a story doesn't have action, we call it slice of life. When it's anything else, though, action is essential. For a simple example, take William Carlos Williams' famous and delightful poem, written to be all about motion. This is just to say, the plums that are in the icebox are so sweet and so cold. Okay, sick. So glad you're sharing that with us, Dr. Williams. It makes sense that plums, which are naturally sweet, would get cold when they're in the icebox. Who cares? Well, probably no one. But of course, that's not the original poem. In the original, the speaker confesses to eating the plums that someone else was probably saving for breakfast. Now we're not just getting a bare description of botanical and thermodynamic fact, we're getting action, the human body in conscious motion. And look, that means something. We get this complex and interesting tension of someone doing something, at least mildly wrong, and then announcing it more than apologizing for it. Because there's some purposeful human action in the poem, we can care about it so much more than the bare statement of facts. Motion happens, but action matters. Now, that's not to say that there can't be motion in stories. Motion is an unavoidable part of life. It just means that motion by itself isn't going to sustain any kind of dramatic tension. So sure, tell the story about the wildfire sparked by lightning, but recognize that the investment, the drama of it all, will come from how your characters take action in response to that wildfire. And it would probably be a letdown if the story just ends with a rainstorm that naturally happens. In that case, you have natural motion undermining the stakes of the action. Not to say that you could never find a way to make it work, just that it's much more likely to fall flat when the story resolves itself independent of any actions taken by the characters. There was a fire, but it's okay now because it started raining, just isn't the most compelling plot synopsis.
Says the actor who thought going to the other side of the room was a good thing to do during a movie's climax.
Ugh, are we still on that?
Yeah, and we will be until you decide to put in a good performance for once in your life.
Well, I'm busy at the moment. So as I was saying, action is generally the key to interesting writing. So don't just set your character on a conveyor belt and let the story happen around them. Give them meaningful things to do that actually have consequences and effect on the story that they're a part of. And as you do, here are a few other things to keep in mind. First, let's be chill about this. As with all things rhetorical, we're dealing with ideas that are likely to make a difference. Slice of life is a whole genre rooted in motion rather than action, and you could surely think of other stories where motion events play significant roles. As always, we're talking about best practices, not axiomatic law. Faulting one story or even 17 stories for relying too much on motion doesn't mean that a 19th story couldn't get away with it. The internet can sometimes be allergic to contingent knowledge, so let this be your intellectual antihistamine. Action is generally the best source of dramatic energy, but you're not being inconsistent if you sometimes resort to motion. You're being a normal person. Speaking of dramatic energy, action really is your best source of it, but motion can have its place. In general, though, motion works better as the cause of tension than as the solution. For example, a story where a protagonist, by way of motion, contracts a viral infection and then has to deal with the effects of the disease while also fighting to free the realm can be an interesting story. But it's much less satisfying if the villain catches a passing virus and succumbs a week before the hero makes it to their lair. We like to feel like our actions matter, and it's unsatisfying to feel like we're at the mercy of uncontrollable events. So narrative tension, being resolved by motion, is likely to leave a reader feeling empty. Although, if you're writing humor, well, maybe an unsatisfying ending like that is exactly the point. Beyond that, though, Burke points out that the difference between motion and action is often down to interpretation. So the protagonist might feel like it's just bad luck that they contracted a disease by way of natural motion, but what if the story zooms out along the way and reveals that the virus was engineered by the villain? Then what we thought was just natural motion becomes action, and the hero overcoming the illness and saving the realm becomes all the more meaningful because the disease wasn't just an unfortunate thing that happened, but a calculated attack enacted by the villain, and that's drama. And again, it's not just fiction. Poems can fall into the trap of just being bare descriptions of things, but who cares? And essays can be just as likely to slide into going through the motions of saying what happened in an overly literal and faithful way, which gets real boring real quick. So, while you're thinking about writing characters who do things that matter rather than ride conveyor belts, you can also think about writing poems that put descriptions in meaningful, action-based contexts, or narrating essays more selectively, curating out the details and events that clearly reveal the thread of agency moving through what you have to say. In fact, that's good advice for anyone. Sure, you can describe every physical motion a person takes to open a door, but odds are that an efficient reference to the action itself, they opened the door, is going to be plenty. Because action is more interesting than motion, you can save a lot of time for everyone by weeding out detailed descriptions of motion and just focusing on the actions that matter. So does your reader really need to know that a character pulled their keys out of their pocket, listened to the house key and car key and office key clinking against each other, opened the door of their car, put the key in the ignition, looked in the rearview mirror while backing out, slowly rolled to the end of the driveway, looked both ways before turning onto the road? Or is it, for the sake of what really matters, enough to know that they drove to the courthouse? In most cases, it's probably enough to know that they took that action to go to the courthouse, and all the component motion would be extraneous and potentially distracting noise. What you choose to describe is what you point your reader's attention to, so it had probably better matter if you're going to spend time on it. And as a final fun thing to think about, you can consider your work itself as action. I had a teacher once who regularly encouraged writers to think about why a story is being told. Why would somebody tell a story about a gloomy produce clerk who gets swept into an alternate dimension and must then vanquish the Archduke of Electro-Parsnips? Is that a story you're telling just to tell, just to go through the motions of telling a story? Or is there some motivation, some willfulness or purpose behind telling it? And it's a question I often ask, especially of poets and essayists who come to me with unsatisfying pieces. A while ago, I was working with a client who had a really interesting collection of short poems, but they all tended to fall a little flat. For each one, I asked that poet why they wrote the piece, and for each one, they told me about an amazing experience and insight that led them to write the poem. But that stuff that made the poem matter, the action behind it, never actually made it onto the page. So the solution was simple. Put the action back in the piece and let readers see why that poem was worth writing in the first place. And that's really the question I end up asking a lot of writers. Why write this piece? Of all the pieces you could write, why this one? The writer usually knows, but for any number of reasons has left that underlying motivation off the page. So the piece ends up reading more like a statement of the fact that plums and iceboxes are cold, rather than the much more interesting confession of breakfast theft. Of course, I'm not asking for a brainless thesis statement that says, I wrote this essay because it talks about my best friend and highlights some unique and interesting things about friendship. But instead, an essay that talks about experiences you had with your friend and maybe also takes some opportunities to step outside of the memories and reflect on their significance. Again, not just going through the motions of what happened, but taking the action of thinking aloud through its significance, the kind of move that's essential to most nonfiction. So in the end, there's a reason that directors don't shout lights, camera, motion. Although they aren't really thinking in Burkean terms, they do understand that motion isn't going to get people into theaters. Action is what's interesting, and action is purposeful, motivated, the kind of thing someone does rather than something that just happens. So if you want to make sure that your writing is really delivering something meaningful and worthwhile, go back in and make sure it's not just putting your readers or characters on an amusement park ride to gawk passively at the animatronics lurching around in front of them. But that's about all I have. Do you want to try shooting the scene again? I think I'm ready now.
Oh no, that's fine. I think we got what we needed from the last take.
Really? I thought you kind of got upset with me.
Oh, I definitely am. You did a terrible job, but we got enough of your voice data that we can just plug it into the alchemical intelligence and generate an even better scene with an artificial replacement. You might have performed terribly, but you did your part to train the AI, and that's worth something too. Want to see it?
That's terrible. No, of course I do not want to see it.
Too bad. Roll the tape.
It's no use. They've overtaken the control tower. At this rate, they'll hack into the alchemical intelligence core and trigger a catastrophic system failure that would make Yellowstone look like a middle school baking soda volcano.
There must be something we can do.
There's only one thing we can do. I'm going to try to talk to the guards about writing. Once they've fallen asleep of boredom, that will be your opening to sneak in and deactivate the subroutines using the power of Kaputko patented alchemical intelligence, available at a low cost for all corporate partners.
Oh, what did we ever do to deserve a hero quite like you?
Well, I'd like to think I'm just doing my job, same as anyone else.
Oh, not you. Kaputko.
That actually makes much more sense. They really do make the world a better place.
You could say that again.